We just heard the familiar story of the disciples after the resurrection, but they're all gathered together in a room, and the door is locked, and they're sitting there in fear. Know that story. We also know the story that we just heard about Thomas, that he was absent and that he was doubting. So there are many things we could say about this whole passage. I'm just going to talk about two things. First thing is this. Have you ever noticed that the risen Christ appeared to those who are gathered together in community, afraid as they were, but he appeared to those who were gathered together in faith. But he didn't appear to Thomas, who was alone. He separated himself from the community. He was on his own. And it wasn't until he joined them that Jesus appeared again to the whole community, once he was back in the community. That tells us something, I believe, about our faith, that we were meant to gather together. In the community, we support one another. We do that in all sorts of ways, just there for some support. There are those who have said, I've heard, that I am religious, but I'm not spiritual. No, it's wrong. I am spiritual, but I'm not religious. Right? Right. And I say, well, good. I'm really happy that you're spiritual, because that spiritual relationship with God is something you can't do without. You can go through the motions, but it's the heart that needs to be engaged. I'm glad you're spiritual. But if you're spiritual and not religious, meaning you don't belong to a group, then you could be in trouble. You could be in trouble because sooner or later in our lives, every one of us, at least once and maybe several times, will be struggling hard enough where we're going to need somebody else to support us in the weakness of our faith. I can talk about this in superficial ways. You know that new translation we have of the Creed? I still have to use my book because I still don't get it. I say it 3 times more than anybody else in here probably, but I still don't have it. And sometimes when I'm looking up and I kind of get into the old translation, the community, we help each other get through it. Okay? Or one time in my last parish, before the new translation, I was doing that little prayer after the Our Father and before the sign of peace, and it says, "Deliver us, O Lord, from all evil," and all that. And I get to the point where it said, "And free us from all sin and protect us from all." That's what they did. The whole group says, "Anxiety." The whole group did. And we all laughed. And we carried one another. They carried me along. And that's great. We can do that in prayer for each other. That's on a more superficial level, important as it is. But there's a much deeper level where we are really struggling. And we know that we're kind of stuck. And we don't know how to get past that. And in the depth of that struggle and that doubt, perhaps, we need other people to be with us. And I found a story about that, not exactly about faith, but you'll get it, I think. It's a story about Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. You remember who she was? She was probably the closest thing we have to an expert on death and those who are dying. Well, one day she did a presentation to a group of seminarians. And in that group of seminarians, she showed them a picture about a child who had terminal cancer, but he refused to talk to anyone, withdrawing behind a wall of silence. The only communication the child had was through his drawings. He wouldn't talk. Well, this particular drawing that she showed him had up in the kind of left-hand corner, had a picture of a nice little cottage surrounded by grass and with some trees and flowers and birds and everything. Then in front of the cottage, there was a family having a picnic, a mom and dad and 2 kids, and that was all right there. It's all very nice, but right in the center of the picture, there was a lone figure, child, standing like this, and in front of the child was a huge military tank about to run him over. So, obviously the tiny figure represented the dying child who saw himself as helpless before a gigantic force which was about to destroy him. So, Dr. Ross asked this group of students, how could you help this child communicate his fears? How could you offer him comfort? What would you do? Well, two of the seminarians took up the challenge. And one asked, looked at picture, copy of the picture, and drew in it another figure standing in front of the tank with a huge sign that said, "Stop." But that was not consoling to the child. Found that out because she gave it to the child and it didn't do anything for him. However, the second seminarian drew another person in the picture, and the person was doing nothing more, nothing less, and standing next to the child, holding his hand. And that broke the wall of silence and enabled the child finally to pour out all his pent-up feelings. All the little fella needed was to know someone was with him. He wasn't alone. And don't we need that too? To know that we're not in it alone, especially in those times when we struggle. We need to be together. And if you say, well, I'm okay right now, I don't need it, well, other people need us when they're kind of weak in their faith, when they're struggling. They need us to be here. That's the one thing. The community. The second thing is this. Jesus appeared after his resurrection to these group of folks, and he appeared with the wounds in his hands and his side and his feet. And wouldn't you think that a risen, glorified body would appear perfect and flawless, and you're all cured, and there's nothing left, of the great wounds. But he didn't. He appeared with the wounds. And I think this was really important for those disciples because they, at that time, were wounded themselves. Because of their dashed fears, their hopes, their fear, they were wounded themselves. And the wounded Christ would speak to the wounds within them. I found this other story then. And it's about an extraordinary woman. Her husband had been injured in a fire as he was trying to save his parents from that fire. But unfortunately, they perished anyway. But he was left with a severe burn on his face, so severe that it disfigured him, and he was so self-conscious that he wouldn't let anybody else see him. He locked himself in his room, and he wouldn't even let his wife in. So after some weeks, she was getting desperate. So she went to a man named Dr. Maxwell Maltz. This is a true story. I looked up his name on the internet. He truly existed. So Dr. Maxwell Maltz, who was a plastic surgeon and a well-known author. And she told him not to worry. He could restore her husband's face. But she replied, "You don't understand, doctor. He won't let anyone see him. He won't accept any help." Then he said, "Well, why are you here?" She replied, "Because I want you to disfigure my face so that I look like he does, and so that he would finally let me back into his life." Oh, Dr. Maltz was shocked. And he said, "I could never do such a thing to anyone." But he's so moved he was by this wife's love for her husband that he said, "Let me talk to him." So she brought him to his house, stood outside the door, knocked on the door and says, "My name's Dr. Martz. I'm a plastic surgeon and I can fix your face." Nothing. Then he said, "Please come out." Nothing. And then he said, I'm here because your wife came to me to ask me to disfigure her face so that she would look like you and you might accept her back into your life. So much does she love you. Very slowly and quietly, the doorknob turned and the door opened. Jesus Christ appears to us with those wounds because he wants us to let him into our wounded lives. And we are wounded, aren't we? We can put up the front. We all do it. But in the quiet of our hearts, we know that we are wounded some way, somehow. And we carry those scars within us. Jesus Christ wants in. So 2 things. Community. We need each other. We need to be there for each other. And to let the risen, wounded Christ into our wounded lives.